Okay, ladies and gentlemen, tune in to our Do Good, Feel Good podcast. We are on episode 6, I believe, and today's episode is all about the power of human connection, which you know for anyone following the One Another journey is our entire purpose to inspire more human connection. But we've got Ben Lucas tuning in today who's going to take us through essentially how he has been both positively and negatively impacted by human connection, and we'll go through some tips and some strategies to help promote it. But ultimately, starting off, Ben, I think it is important to set the scene, and I know you have had, I guess, impacts of negative and lack of human connection. So if you just want to talk us through that experience, then we'll go from there.
Sure. So I guess, firstly, thanks for having me. It's good to sit here and be chatting. I think my kind of journey into the human connection space started from when I was in high school. So my kind of story really quickly is I had a really awesome life growing up, super, I guess, like normal by my standards. I'd say I was pretty fortunate. And then my dad got diagnosed with bowel cancer. He was sick for 4 years and passed away the year I started my HSC, so in year 12. And I was really lucky through that experience because I had just like an unreal relationship with him, and I had a great like community of people around me, and there was lots of positives through that. But the biggest learning or takeaway that I took from that experience was how when he was sick, everyone would ask how I was going and how he was doing, and sort of check in on you. And then once he passed away, I found like all those questions stopped because people, I guess, just feel uncomfortable or don't know what to say. And so I kind of called some friends out on it and was like, this is kind of bullshit. Like, I want to be talking about stuff. You all used to ask how I was going and now you don't. And I guess it was probably like me feeling isolated in a sense, in like part of the grief of that experience. But by saying to people like, hey, it's all good to ask me, like that's kind of what we should be doing. Just giving people the permission to do that and like put in an emphasis on communication. Like I was able to shift that and have a bunch of mates who were like super interested in looking out for me. And that kind of started me talking about mental health or the importance of it. And mostly through the lens of like what I noticed was that like people just don't know how to ask people stuff. Like I just, I sit here now and it's like, it's crazy to me that we just don't talk about enough stuff. And so what I've learned through that experience and sort of the journey it set me on was just like how important people actually are to us, and like connecting with other people and communicating with them and being a part of communities. And so like those are kind of the big 3 C's that I'm super passionate about. So it's also
which is what? Connecting,
communication, connection, and community. So I kind of picture that as like a triangle of 3 things you need. So what I say to people is you need to communicate effectively, and communication to me is like expressing yourself and sharing things about you. And I don't think we do that very well, particularly blokes. And if you do that well, you form connections with people because you're being vulnerable and you're showing interest in others, right? And then when people connect in larger groups, that's how you form communities. And like we're still tribal sort of beings, right? Like no one has ever survived in history without being a part of a tribe or a community. Like that's where people are happiest. But I just think so much stuff these days in society like isn't set up for us to do that stuff. So my kind of realization recently is like we actually have to be intentional with chasing that stuff because like no one's going to hand it to you. And I think that's why when you kind of reflect on the state of society or a lot of people, like loneliness is on the rise, mental health super poor because we're not doing these things that are actually getting like harder and harder to do.
So back to those best friends who you went and called out, who essentially stopped asking how you were doing post your father's death. Did they have any excuses that came to mind, or what was their response?
So it was what I did was I had like this urge that I needed to do something in the mental health space. So I'd come up with this idea. I was going to start a brand or a project called 2 Minute Mates, and my idea was that like it only takes 2 minutes to check in on someone, and I just wanted to put that message out there that like it's a really small thing to do, but it might be the thing that someone needs. So I invited like 10 guys over from like footy, schoolmates. I think one of my cousins was there, like a bit of a mix of people. Told them about this thing. and kind of said like, none of you have been asking how I'm going. It was really awkward, like super awkward at first. And everyone was a bit like, oh, yeah, like you're right, like I don't really know how to do it, or like I'm a bit scared or worried by it. But then also like people started saying stuff that they'd been holding on to, that they, like someone was like, oh, actually like my mum's going through something and I haven't told anyone, or someone else was like, this happened to me and I haven't really told anyone. So I think once you show that bit of like vulnerability, people relate to that, or like they've got their own stuff going on that they want to express as well. But there's just, I call it these like invisible barriers or like invisible rules that we've kind of put up. And I think also because we haven't practiced them or practiced sharing stuff, like it feels uncomfortable. The analogy is like if you go into the gym and you try and lift up heavy weights, like it's hard, right?
Hard, yeah.
So you go every day and you do smaller weights so that one day you can go in and you can deadlift 100 kilos. And like emotions are kind of the same thing, where we don't practice sharing our emotions or expressing our emotions in the day-to-day. And then someone's parent passes away, or they lose a job, or they go through a breakup, and we don't know how to deal with it because like we've got...
It's a big step.
Yeah, happiness, anger, sadness is like kind of the three things we learn as kids, and then, or we did when we were young. And then all the other stuff we're just left to kind of figure out by ourselves.
So then what is a way that we can encourage our friends and humanity to take those baby steps in conversations?
Yeah.
Is there a strategy or a thought?
Yeah, for sure. I think like something I love telling people to do is like if I do a presentation or a workshop or a talk on this kind of stuff, is like give people a bit of homework where I say, know your barista's name. This is a really simple way. You can just do this every day or every week, is when you go and order a coffee and you give them their order and they ask you your name for the order, just ask them what their name is as well. And like that just starts a conversation. And sometimes the conversation I have with a barista is just like, no one ever asks you your name, do they? And you're like, nah. But every time you do that, you see this kind of, it's a great example because you see this kind of connection form with someone where they're just like, hey, like, thanks, Ben. Or when you go to leave, they're like, see you, Ben, have a good day, or whatever it might be. And it's just an example of how like there's so many moments in a normal day that we could be connecting with people, but we're not. And it's mostly because we're just looking at our phones, right? Like everyone's in that kind of world. And I find it fun, or like it's a bit of a game to me to just like have conversations with people that you wouldn't normally, and it's like almost a game because people think it's weird, and I kind of like there's a funny element to it, but you can also see that people actually enjoy connecting with people. So I think that's like a kind of way that you can, I guess, practice or test putting yourself like out of your comfort zone. The other is just like starting it with your friends, like whether that's for a group of guys deciding that you're going to tell your mates you love them and just establishing that. And if it might feel weird for a bloke to say to their mates, hey, we should all tell each other we love each other. But I guarantee that like they've all done that after 10 beers. They've just never done it when they're sober, right? So it's just readjusting some of these rules.
Retraining the mind.
Yeah, or just questioning like, why is it we do or we don't do something? And just, I guess, looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah. And that's a great mini task for everyone listening. I'd probably say 50% don't know the barista's names. So after listening to this, go and find out, and please share stories about how it made you feel.
So I told that story in a workshop to a bunch of mates, and a mate of mine sent me a message like a month or two after, and he was like, hey, I was in the city for work, went to get a coffee. This barista was like, could tell they were super stressed, like just sort of a bit frantic. And he just said to them like, hey man, are you all good? Like, seems like you got a bit going on. And they were like, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. They had a small conversation. When my friend went to leave, the barista said to him like, hey, no one ever asks me how I'm doing. And like, I really needed that today. And for me, that was like such an awesome message to get from my friend, because he wouldn't have done that otherwise. But it's just like, it's a perfect example of like that person, that's a tough job if you've got to pump out 500 coffees in a morning. Everyone's telling you what their name is, and then just
almond milk.
Yeah, it's getting harder and harder with all the milk types, right? And then people just sit on their phones and kind of ignore you while you're there. So just acknowledging someone's doing a good job, or that they exist sometimes, like as small and petty as that seems. Like I think there's there's just something really human about that, right?
But to that question of, hey, how are you? I do similar workshops and actually encourage everyone not to ask, hey, how are you? And what is a different question?
Yeah.
Because in Australia, what happens when you typically go in a lift or go to the barista, hey, how are you? Good.
And then,
Yourself? Yeah, not bad.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
You know, what in your mind are some other questions that in that exact same situation where we see that barista stressed, can we say something a bit more different than how are you?
I think it's a really good point. It's part of the whole piece of connecting with people, I guess, is like breaking those scripts of like the, hey, how are you? Good, yeah, sweet. Like, and that just, it's just like a script that runs that we're so used to. So just changing the question up. You can get like a bit creative with it, or just like reframe it. So
how's your morning going?
Yeah, how's your morning going? Hey, and then if really it's about then the follow-up questions. So like if somebody says, oh yeah, all right, like you go, oh, just all right, why is that? And then they've got to explain to you, oh, you know, I've just had a bit on. What have you had on? Like, work's been busy, I'm a bit stressed at work. Oh, why? What's happening at work? I think it's sometimes not as much about coming out with like a crazy sort of starting question, like, what's your favorite color? Or like, what's the best thing you did this week? And they're like,
what?
Who's this guy?
Yeah.
But I think it's the follow-up questions are super important because to your point, blokes will just like, mostly blokes will topic jump, right? Where they just like, how's your week been? Oh, pretty shit house. Oh, why is that? Like, work's stuffed, whatever. And then we're like, oh, okay. Did you see the footy last night? And so we just, like, there's an opportunity there to like unpack that or help someone share something, but we don't like take the bait for it. I think, I hate to generalize, but communication particularly I think is super different from like males and females, and women, they just practice it more so they're better at it. But I think they're just taught to do it from a younger age as well, whereas it's kind of like not beat out of us, but like we just lose that as blokes particularly. Or that's kind of my been my experience with it.
Yeah, you know, and that's my sister-in-law asked me the same question. It's like, why do you think you communicate better with girls than you do males? And I think it's just because girls generally communicate better. Yeah,
I've learnt so much on communication from my wife, because for me to be present and like supportive of her, I've had to learn to adjust how I communicate. And then it's just taking some of that like pretty simple stuff and applying it to other areas where I probably wouldn't. And I think that was probably one of the like more eye-opening things for me as somebody who started to openly talk about mental health and the importance of it, was like, if you become that person in your friendship group, everyone is like so accepting and welcoming of that, and then starts to like really appreciate or celebrate you for being like that. And that, like, it's not an ego thing. Like, it feels good. It's awesome to be known as a person that anyone in the friendship group feels like they can go to for stuff, and that you can kind of, I don't want to say take a leadership role, because that's like, sounds like the wrong kind of thing for a friendship group, but to establish that like, hey, you know, if we are all going to catch up, we're all going to ask each other how we're going first, and like make sure that if someone's not showing up to things or someone's acting differently or out of character or whatever, that we flag it and we acknowledge it. Because for a long time I was in groups of blokes, and probably still am to an extent, that stuff just like, we all know something's going on, but no one knows how to talk about it. It's like a mate goes through a breakup and it's like, oh, we should probably get him down to the pub to watch the footy or whatever. And then people will do that and not even mention the breakup. So it's like, that's not really helping, because it's just like, oh, we're keeping them busy or whatever, but you're not acknowledging the thing that's going on. So it's like kind of bizarre.
It seems like the underlying theme is uncomfortability.
To
be talking about these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And you just mentioned a baby step to overcome uncomfortability is these sort of interactions with your barista.
Yeah.
Is there anything before that? Interacting with your barista is still probably a big step for a lot of people who are not used to talking to strangers.
Yeah.
Like, is there a book, or is there talking to yourself in the mirror?
Yeah.
Or like, how can we build up confidence, and particularly in males,
to
be, I guess, confident enough to take that first conversation with the barista? Is there anything we can do as individuals before the conversation?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a good question, because and it's a difficult kind of puzzle to solve, because I think that like the missing piece or the starting point for people to express a lot more is like doing a bit of self-reflection and like also being willing to be vulnerable, right? Because if you're not willing to share stuff yourself, how can you expect other people to share things with you? And so by doing that, it kind of forces you to do a bit of reflection, I think. And there's a heap of really good books that I think just talk about the importance of this stuff and sort of spotlight or make you more aware of like the importance of it and the way that you can actually kind of communicate a bit better, for example. A really good book that I found that had quite an impact on me is Lost Connections by Johan Hari. It's a great book. And then there's another book that I read recently called Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg, and he's an American guy, I think he's a researcher or a scientist. But he looked at like, there are people that are like what he calls super communicators, that are like, they're not necessarily people that are like super clever or like really smart or really articulate in the way that they speak, but they're the kind of people that after you spend time with them, you're just like, man, like that person's a great person to be around. And he kind of breaks down 3 things that people do well, which is like show people that they're listening, repeat back to them that you've heard what they're saying, and like basically, I can't remember what the third one is, I'll butcher it, but it's like basically show interest in people and like be aware of other people's like needs and how a conversation, there can be like 2 people sort of having different needs from a conversation, and that's where a lot of like miscommunication comes from.
Yeah.
So I found that was just a book that gave me a really different perspective on like, I think one of the things he says in the book is like, sometimes you're having a conversation with someone, but you're not actually talking about the thing that is the topic of the conversation. It's like you've both come in with preconceived ideas and what you want to get out of it. And sometimes like that's not going to kind of work. And people that are super communicators are just aware of that and know how to meet the other person and make them feel like a bit more heard.
But I think it's also being present in the conversation.
Yeah, massive one, yeah.
You know, I find myself sometimes drifting off, you know, thinking about life, work, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's when you're not active listening, and that's when you just go,
Yeah. That's been working on that a lot, and it's a thing with a partner where like I hate the idea of after a day of work we're both sitting on the couch like scrolling our phones and having like a really kind of just bland conversation about was like, how was your day, and not asking those follow-up questions, not really listening to what they're saying. And you just like, I feel like I'm quite in tune with myself that like I don't feel energized or settled after conversations like that, or when I've been sitting there just like scrolling stuff or watching stuff. I feel like disconnected from things.
Yeah. What's your take on therapy ideally becoming more mainstream?
Yeah, massive.
I've always been quite jealous of some of my girlfriends or just some people I know who get to go and see their therapist once a month or once every 2 weeks to talk about a whole range of deep emotional shit.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds fucking awesome.
It's great.
Males, let's just be, you know, we don't really do that.
Yeah.
You know, I guess I can only probably do it with my girlfriend. I don't really have too many close girlfriends unless we're, you know, on boozing or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's like, I wonder if that could be a fix where either schools or governments or work, maybe mandate's the wrong word, but highly encourage males to do therapy once a month.
Yeah.
Or something along those lines.
Man, I'm a huge advocate for it. Like, I first saw a psychologist when I was in high school when my dad was sick. I was probably 15 or 16, didn't want to go, thought it was a waste of time. My sister was going, my mum was going, my dad was going.
And how was that first step? Were you shitting bricks during the first step, or were you quite open to it? Because everyone listening is probably like, fuck off, man, I'm not going to go to a therapist, you know?
I was a little bit like skeptical, and I think we've got like the Hollywood version of therapy that you're like lying on a couch and there's a dude with like little circle glasses writing down your feelings and asking you to like express things. It doesn't, well, in my experience, a good therapist doesn't feel like that. The way that I try and think about it, and I'll try and articulate this the best I can, is like, there's, I think, 7 billion people on Earth right now. There's been God knows how many people before us. Psychology has existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so, like, you're telling me that you think no one has ever felt the way you feel about something or experienced the thing you're feeling. Like, that's just a ridiculous thought process to be in. And so what I find it's like is you go in and somebody, it's like a horoscope for your feelings that's like, feels real. It's like someone reads you a horoscope and you go, oh yeah, maybe I am a bit this or a bit that, but you go kind of whatever. But you sit down with someone, you tell them something that's happened and they go, oh, well, you might find that you tend to feel like this, or has it made you feel this way? And you're like, yeah, how'd you know? It's like they're kind of holding your cards, like reading them back to you. And you just feel fucking better when you leave. Like you feel lighter, you feel understood. It gives you clarity on things because you're forced to articulate stuff. And I think getting stuff out of your head and into your mouth or onto a page, like if you're journaling or writing stuff, is super important because we have way more, like we think quicker than we can sort of articulate. Yeah. And once you put something down on paper, you might think, that's ridiculous that I'm feeling that way or have expressed that. And it changes your perspective on it or it gives you an understanding of it. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate for it. I think the challenge is like, and what we're seeing at the moment is there's a lot of technology trying to improve the access for therapy. But I don't think that better access should mean therapists get paid less. And that's part of the challenge is that like, it can be an expensive venture, right? So that you can get subsidies through your private health insurance, going to a GP and getting a healthcare plan, whatever it might be. But I think the battle is like, these people are really smart. It takes a long university degree to get qualified in doing this stuff. How do we make sure that digital platforms that exist aren't just like undercutting them, or then we'll just end up with a therapist shortage the same way we've got with like teachers and public service workers because people don't want to do the work and be underpaid for it.
Well, I've always found it bamboozling that our most important roles in human society, judges, police officers, nurses, school teachers, therapists, are so long to get and minimal paid.
Yeah.
Shouldn't it be the opposite? Shouldn't they be the most paid?
Yeah, it's a battle with the sort of like
how to spend taxpayers' money, I guess.
Yeah, and the kind of commercial capitalist world we live in, right?
Yeah.
I think we'll get there, and I love the thing you said before about like the idea of someone seeing a therapist once a month, and it's something that I was talking about recently. Was when sometimes you hear celebrities talk about like their or famous people or successful people talk about their like therapist or their counsellor, and it's someone they've known for like 6 to 10 years. And I think a lot of people have this idea of therapy as like something you go and do for a period of 6 months after someone's died or whatever. But I love the thought of it being somebody that you have a longer term relationship with because they know you really well. And you kind of have these check-ins, like you're supposed to go and see. You don't have a reason
to go to the therapist. The therapist is always on.
Yeah, exactly. Like people go to a dentist once a year or a GP and do a checkup. If you get 6 sessions on your mental health care plan, so you get a rebate on those and it's more accessible. I love the idea of going every 8 weeks or every 2 months and doing your check-ins because it goes back to that sort of lifting weights in the gym thing. If something happens, you're just better equipped for it. Or you've got an avenue that you know where you can go to get support, because I think that's the other challenge we have is like when someone's going through stuff, they don't necessarily know where to go to get help or who they can talk to.
And I've never been to a therapist and I can't wait and would love to. Absolutely. And it's like my mind goes to how can we turn your mates into everyday therapists?
Yeah.
Like 'cause therapy is a price point, it is still, a big step for argument's sake. So how can we turn your mates, and then better yet, everyday strangers, or how can we sort of get those therapy-like conversations happening amongst your mates?
I think I'm trying to remember who organises it.
And they always happen after booze and fucking drugs.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do we get them happening sober?
Yeah, I've do that when I'm running mental health first aid courses. There's a section on substance abuse, and we've just spent like 2 or 3 hours talking about how to have a conversation with someone, and then I'm like, who's had a conversation about something with someone after 10 drinks or after 3 a.m, and every hand goes up, and I was like, who followed up the conversation? And like all the hands go down. Because that's when stuff comes out, right? But then we kind of wake up and go, oh, Jesus Christ.
So maybe that's the first step, following up on the 3 a.m. conversation.
Yeah, that's something I did.
Because they're happening a lot.
Yeah, I did this a couple of years ago. Sort of made a pact to myself when I was getting into this stuff. Was that if I had a conversation with someone when we were out on the beers or it was late at night or whatever,
follow up.
I'd put a note in my phone, and if I woke up and I had a note in my phone about it, I had to follow it up.
Boom.
And so sometimes it was just acknowledging
that you heard
that we'd had the conversation. And the reason that's super important is because if someone confides in you or shares something when you're in an intoxicated state, that might be the first time they've actually told someone, because it's the first time they've had the confidence or felt safe enough to share. And so if you don't act on that or acknowledge that, it might be really hard for them to ever
do that again. Unless they're in that state again.
So it's super important that if someone tells you something in a state like that, you actually do follow it up. And I would pretty confidently say, like, with 100% success rate, just messaging someone and going, hey mate, I know we had a chat about this last night. We don't even have to go into the details of it, but like, glad you told me. And if you want to talk about it more, I'm here. And people are just like, that. Dude, I'd love that you
texted me. And it's not hard to do a text.
Me that. Like, it means a lot. And then I've had people that I've done that with, like, tell me a year or two down the track, like how much that actually, like, you can tell that it really sticks with people and that they might end up going and seeing a therapist or whatever. Because I think, like, what's the role of the mate versus the therapist, right? And this is something that gets taught in mental health first aid, is like, you want to be able to intervene early, I guess, to get people to help quicker. So if we're talking about like poor mental health or mental illness, the sooner someone can get professional help, the more likely they are to actually recover. And so sometimes it's not our job to fix someone, it's just our job to get them to the right place. And I think that's the role that like mates can play, is like acknowledge that someone's experiencing a shit time or going through something, and then just kind of guide them to what the right resources or channels
what are the right resources? Let's just use a 3 a.m. conversation.
Yeah. You
acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Then you're saying guide them to the right resources. What are some potential resources we could guide them?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think like therapy is the number one. It's the most successful thing we've ever found. Like, it's as simple as this. The most successful way we've figured out to deal with people's mental health is
talk about it.
Like, it's undefeated in helping people, really. Sometimes it's getting people to go and see a GP because they might, one, get a referral. It's something that people feel more comfortable with because we all know the experience of going to a GP, so it doesn't feel as different. Getting someone professional help if they've got challenges, basically, I wouldn't even say serious challenges, like any challenges, like go and get some form of professional help, which is usually speaking to someone. And then you look at supportive measures. So if they are drinking or they're taking substances, that's probably not helping, right? So changes to their behaviours. There's 1,000 podcasts on the importance of diet and sleep and exercise, reading self-help books, getting sunlight, being around people. Like, all those things are important. But I think when it comes to ill mental health, those things don't necessarily fix someone, because I know a lot of people, like, young, fit, handsome, doing all those things and still fucking miserable, because if you are struggling to comprehend your thoughts and your feelings or even your actions and behaviours, like, going to the gym more is not necessarily going to fix that.
So out of that scenario, what is the missing link that is potentially causing that mental health challenge? Could be ignorant, but is it a chemical imbalance? I know people sometimes don't like saying that, but if you're doing what you're saying you're doing, you've got a good diet, you've got a good purpose at work, you're surrounded by good friends, you're getting sunlight, you're eating well, you're sleeping well, and you're still having this hole.
Yeah.
What is potentially causing that hole?
It can be if they meet the criteria for like a diagnosable mental illness, which is super common. It's like 1 in 5 people in Australia each year will experience one of those. So sometimes when we think about mental illness, we think of like the extreme things like bipolar or psychosis or schizophrenia. But depression and anxiety are 1 in 5. Like, they're super common, and they're not as extreme as people think they are. Like, I think more people meet that diagnosis than they realise. Like, someone might meet the criteria, but they don't get diagnosed because they don't go and get help. But to go back to what you were saying, I think it's not necessarily always a chemical imbalance, because life's fucking hard. Like shit happens. Stuff goes on that we're not really prepared for. And I think sometimes we just don't quite know how we're supposed to cope with that stuff. And I think that's the whole challenge of what we need to try and normalize, is that like everyone's just trying to figure it out. Like no one's done this, no one's played this game before. Like we're all just trying to have a crack. And I think there's a lot of pressure, more and more so pressure and expectation that particularly young people put on themselves, that you're supposed to look a certain way or be achieving a certain thing by a certain age. Like I think social media fuels this massively, that like we're all our own biggest critics, and there's a human sort of element to that because it's wired into survival. But I think we've just arrived at this point where like that's been accelerated or exaggerated so much that like people might feel like shit and not really know why they feel like shit, or they just feel like they're not good enough. Like so many people I think have that inner critic, and that's not necessarily a chemical imbalance. That could be a product of the environment they were raised in, experiences they've been exposed to. It could be a number of different things, which is why it's really hard as well, because we haven't been able to go, oh, it's this thing that's causing the mental health crisis. If we can just solve this, everyone will be all right. There's so many different kind of avenues and ways in. And I think that's why as well, a lot of people don't get help, because they see somebody who has a mental illness and it's hard for them to understand that they could sit on the same sort of scale as that person has been diagnosed with a mental illness, because they go, well, I've got a good job, I live in a nice place, maybe they've got positive relationships. So they've got all the things that on paper say that they would be happy, and then they still feel like there's just this emptiness in them. And I don't really have the answers for that. I think that's where like therapy is incredible, right? Because I think like our perspectives on a lot of stuff are for better or worse, just kind of wrong sometimes.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We're talking about, I guess, the power of human connection, and what we've touched upon is, I guess, the importance of communication in this, and some basic tips to try and help with communication if it is feeling uncomfortable or scary. You know, finding out your barista's name, acknowledging your late night conversation that you've had with friends. You know, this is all around communication. But what other elements of human connection, if for some reason we can't communicate and we don't want to communicate, how else can everyday humans go about getting human connection? Because human connection is a basic need of life. Along with the 6 other Maslow needs, human connection is one of them. Let's say communication's out of the picture. What else can we everyday humans do to foster more human connection?
Well, I think it's a good point, because this is where like there's a difference between communication and connection, right? And a good like case study of this is lockdowns, right? Like, and I'll often share this in a workshop. I'd say to a group of people, like, who in lockdowns formed some sort of weird community with their neighbours? And like most people put their hands up, and I go, "What'd you do?" And they're like, "Oh, we, helped the old guy downstairs with something, or like we put people's bins in for them while they were." In isolation because they had COVID, or we had street parties because we weren't allowed to go anywhere else. And like people started to do all these things because they were going through a shared experience with people around them. And shared experience is something that's like being lost a bit, because everyone is getting a online experience that's more and more personalized to them. So my Instagram feed doesn't look like yours. My Netflix doesn't look like yours. My emails don't look like yours, all those kind of things. Whereas if you go back 20 years, like there was 3 TV networks. So
3 newspapers.
Everyone had more shared experience, which is how you actually connect with other people, because there's this feeling of like collectiveness and being a part of something, or experiencing the same things as other people. So I think if you take out the communicating piece, like it's a good example that you don't always have to be communicating with people to be connecting with them. If you go to a concert or a sporting event, like atmosphere is a whole bunch of people experiencing the same thing.
Shared experience.
It's a shared experience. Like there's a reason that a grand final has a different feeling to a round game, is because you can kind of feel everyone's emotions and investment, and you can feel and that's not just done through, verbal expression. That's through something else. And so that, like at a small level, that might be standing up for an elderly person on the bus, or
Shared
just like
experience.
smiling at someone as you walk past them down the street, or, you know, picking something up in a grocery store for someone. Like there's so many little things that we can kind of do that is, I think, like it's been a part of society in a way, in a more present way, to use that word again. Because, you know, I'm only 29, but I feel like even I can feel how that sort of stuff has changed. And I know it's a bit of a, like people say it's a city thing, like it's a bit of a, like if you go regionally, there is more of a community feel, there's more of a connection to people. But I think like it's just kind of slowly being eroded. So if we take the communication piece out of it, like there's still ways to connect with people. There's just kind of like acknowledging people, understanding, like having empathy for them, but not necessarily sympathy. Being present in the space you're in, like just being a positive contributor to whatever it is that you're a part of.
Yeah. So have you born and raised Sydney?
Yeah, I grew up in Sydney, lived in Seaforth till I was probably like mid-20s, and then I moved to Melbourne for work for 2 years, and then came back and been on the beaches in Freshie since then.
How was the community element different between Sydney and Melbourne?
Yeah, it's a good question. People talk, if you're like out on a night out in Melbourne, people talk more to you generally. Like it's Sydney's very cliquey, and I've got theories on this because...
Please, I'm trying to get to the fucking bottom of it.
So Melbourne is like all grid and it's easier to move around. And because it's easier to move around, you have, like, if you go into the city on a night out and you talk to people, there's people from all over the place there because it's easier to get there.
Yeah.
On the northern beaches, people don't go out in Bondi, or they don't even go to the city. So it becomes very like insular in different parts of Sydney. Like we kind of think about like the west, there's the north, there's the east, like there's the south down in the Shire. And so people spend more time in their sort of smaller bubbles. And there's just a bit of like tribalism, I think, that comes with that.
It's a good theory.
So I think that plays a part in it. I think there's probably other factors as well. Like Sydney's got, you know, the CBD has more of like a New York feel. Like if you compared New York and LA, it's probably the same thing. People are like, oh, people are grumpy in both, but New York's worse. I think that's like a Sydney-Melbourne thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think like for whatever reason, we've just like let our bubbles get smaller, right? And like I'll go to work in the city or be in Surrey Hills or whatever, and people be like, oh, you're from the beaches. And I'm like, how do you know? And they're like, the way you talk and dress and whatever. So like there's like visual identifiers that come with that, right, as well.
Yeah. But even, you know, I talk about this a lot with single mates. It's like talking to a person of the opposite sex in Sydney is very difficult.
Yeah.
For some, you know, for a lot.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, right, where I'm always super conscious of this, of like, even if you're not hitting on someone, sometimes like if you're out, you feel like you can't say something to a woman without, you're like, oh, I hope I'm not being creepy. I hope they don't think I'm being creepy. Like my mates are going to think I'm trying to hit on them. Like there's all these things going through your head. And it's like, all of that I think exists for a bunch of different reasons, but it already is like a barrier between just being polite to someone. I had an experience when I moved to Melbourne. I moved into a share house with two brothers that were a bit older than me, and a guy from Denmark. And the brothers said to me, oh, meet us out in Richmond at a pub after like a Friday, grab a couple of beers, watch the footy or whatever. And I was like, yeah, cool. I figured out they were those people that notoriously run late. So I was waiting for like 45 minutes or an hour. They're like, sorry, we're on the way. So I was like standing there with a beer, watching the AFL on the TV. All the tables are full. So I'm just standing there by myself. And then there was like a table of girls there, and one of them was like, hey, if you're just watching the footy, like feel free to grab a seat on the end of the table. And I was like, oh,
great,
thanks. And so I sat there and kind of watched the footy, had some conversation with them. There was no like, oh, my friend thinks you're cute. There was no like, tell me about you. Where are you from? Like, where you mean? There was none of that. It was just like, it was simply
an interaction,
hey,
human connection.
If you want to sit down, like instead of standing there, you can sit down, and like because you're sitting at our table, we'll talk. But there doesn't have to be any sort of like, I don't know, intent or like whatever else comes with it. But I think that's, it's funny that that's a Melbourne experience because to your point,
that is very rare in Sydney, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem that like is hard to solve because how do you get 150 people in a pub and go, let's all just be nice to each other, no one be creepy. Like, and part of it exists because unfortunately there are people that are fucking creeps out there that like it only takes a few bad eggs to ruin it for everyone. And so I think it makes total sense that women in public spaces feel like they don't want to be harassed by blokes. Like look at the news cycle and some of the horrible things that have happened this year. So it's kind of like in a way we've like, men have brought it on themselves, but I think it's so hard to fix as well because you've got to have the opportunities to fix it. And I think those opportunities don't necessarily exist in like the way that we're kind of talking about.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's potentially psychological and also environmental. So my perfect analogy is I've born and raised in my whole life, and then I went and moved over to Austin, Texas for about 3 years.
Yeah.
And it was the greatest 3 years of my life and the happiest I've ever been. And I'm always trying to actually sort of wonder why.
Why that was.
Why that was. And I put it to, the ability to travel, sport, and all this sort of other generalizations people actually just say. Then I actually thought deeper, and it's a great analogy, is in Austin, right? When you go out to the bars and when you go out to the pubs, they have setups where you have bar stools at the bar.
Yeah.
Right? And that essentially, environmentally, is a physical asset in the bar that encourages individuals who want to get away from their family, who are just living it alone, to go to a bar, to sit at an individual bar stool, and it's typically to watch sport.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Other individuals
sit
at the bar stools, and then of course you get chatting.
Yeah.
And the bar staff are very friendly because they rely on tips, so then you get chatting to the bar staff.
Yeah.
So that is a small environmental change which encourages
really good point.
individuals to chat. Name me one pub in Australia where you could confidently go as an individual and have a good time.
Mate, it's a really good point, yeah.
Not one in my life of being here.
Yeah.
There are either groups of twos or groups of fours or big, huge groups on dance floors.
Or, booths, right?
Or
Stuff
booths.
Like that, I think another thing that plays a part, like I've got a tendency to shit on social media because I've worked in social media, so I think I'm hyper aware of the damage that it can cause. I've had like my own challenges with managing my own social use. Like I'm quite anti it. So I try not to push that narrative too much. But I think if you look at dating apps as well, like that's not an environment that encourages people to connect in a effective way. Like if anything, it promotes that like how you look is the most important thing. I've never been on dating apps, so I can't really talk from experience, but the stuff you hear from it is that like people get ghosted, like conversations, like it sounds like a pretty negative experience. And I think more and more like that is something that started online but is like kind of moved into the real world with the way that people
But is it trends?
interact.
Is it going to come back offline into the real world? We've seen a few apps which are essentially using technology to get people into the real world, us being one of them. But you know, bucket hats, clothes, music, it's all trends. Will dating eventually come back to online and
I think so.
in person?
Like people already say that run clubs are like where are popping off because people love being active, but they love meeting other people as well, right? So I think there's like definitely more forms of that. There's a dating app in the UK called Thursday, which is around like getting people into venues only on a Thursday.
I love them.
So I think that like, there is a pendulum swing, but I think that like the vast majority of people are not being exposed to that still. I think it's like a fortunate position to be in, I guess. I'd love to see it shift, and I think that like on a macro level, the trend that's happening is that we will become a bit more tribal again because we're starting to understand the need to connect to our space and the people around us. So COVID's a good example of that, of like kind of, there was an element of community that formed, but then the trade-off of tribalism is that like how the psychology of tribalism works is that the group of people around me keep me safe against the other groups of people. So
if you're not in that group, you're an enemy.
That's why the northern beaches and the eastern suburbs have this sort of competitiveness towards each other because it's different. And there's like
the friendly competitiveness, I would argue, is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's when it's, I guess, not friendly competitiveness.
Yeah. There's a study that was mentioned in, I think it was a book I read or a podcast. Like I'm really bad at remembering where I got this information.
As long as it sticks.
Yeah, but they basically took, if you take groups of people, like whether they're school kids, corporates, whatever, and if you break them into teams and go like your team this, your team that, and then you give the team sort of traits, by nature, people will develop narratives about like why they hate the other teams and why their group is better than the others, even if the people in the groups have no similar traits or like connecting points themselves. So it's this kind of like human nature that we have to go like, oh, I'm in a team of 4 for this activity. Well, naturally, I think my team's better than the other teams, and that we'd beat them at this, and the problem with them is that. And like we make up these things in our head, and that's just human nature, because like,
well, it's like that.
No one's taught us that, right?
It's that Stanford prison example where they gave half the people prisoners and the other half were the coppers, essentially. And that shit got out of fucking hand quickly. Have you seen that movie?
I've heard about that.
Watch the doco.
There's a doco.
There's a doco on it. It's about an hour and a half, and it's a real life experiment. I'm pretty sure it's called Stanford.
Yeah.
And it is crazy.
How quickly.
It was only within 5 days.
Yeah.
Like, it is crazy.
I find that stuff really interesting, because I think we're at a point where we've got we've got the technology to figure out how to use that stuff for good, or like for our betterment. Because I think the kind of rocket ship of the internet and the access to technology and stuff is like, we've kind of just been going with the flow, because like some people have been making shitloads of money and like it's done a lot of good for us, but we haven't really had enough time to go like, well, what are the broader consequences of this? And I think we're starting to see that and go like, oh, there's probably better way, like we can have all this, but there's probably better ways to go about it. And some of that is like legislation, some of that is just people changing their behaviours. Some of it is like, I mean, it's tied to a whole bunch of different stuff, right? But I think we're in like almost version 2 of like what life's going to look like with all this kind of stuff, because the world is just so different now to what it was 20 years ago. Probably more different than any other like 20-year period in history, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes we just like, what's the phrase? Like sometimes we just do things because we can, not because we should, or something like that.
Yeah, and your point on legislation, one thing I've always thought about for probably about 6-7 years now is regarding social media, is governments, the same as they did with alcohol and tobacco, after they realised it was bad for people and killing people, they brought in taxes, which ultimately was a way for government to make a fuckload of money, but that essentially did slow down alcohol and tobacco consumption. It's like eventually I think the answer to help moderate social media, because on or off is not the answer. Education and how to use it is the answer, in my opinion. So somehow I think the government may be able to step in and potentially on every single phone in the planet you can only get 2 hours of social media, or ban social media at school, or however they do it, somehow tax it or moderate it.
Well, China already does that, right? Like there's, I mean, not that we want to follow all of the things the Chinese government does, but
social media is directly correlated to suicide,
massively,
death. So there needs to be some form of solution to help with that.
I think there is the thing that's going on at the moment that's super interesting in that space is these antitrust trials with Google, which like most people aren't hearing about because it's super complex, but like my understanding of it, which I've learned from a guy called Ricky Sutton, who's like just super smart guy and is looking into this stuff, is that the internet now is almost like a human right or a utility, right? Like if you ask people what they need to survive, they'll tell you like water, power, the internet.
Roof, internet.
And so it should be treated that way. Like the internet should almost be mandated like a government kind of like a public service, right? But the problem is that it hasn't been, it's been privatized. So it's run by huge companies like Google. And these antitrust cases is basically like European and American governments trying to prove that
they can't be trusted.
That Google's got a monopoly and that they are like basically dictating what happens in politics and in media to suit them.
What's that? The US election through Facebook advertising?
And so they've lost 2 out of the 3 trials so far, and the third one's like a month away. And like the outcome of it will be that they'll try and break up the monopoly that Google has. So like separating Google and YouTube to be different companies. And the whole theory is that like, if you go to the internet to find information, you want to know that the information you get in is true, but also like fairly given to you, not dictated by what benefits a company commercially. And that's kind of like, it's
like Google
a
ads,
bit of
YouTube
a bit of a
ads.
rabbit hole of stuff. But
Yeah.
like that's the world that we've lived in for the last 10 or 15 years, is that like most stuff is given to us for a reason, not because it's fair or true or it's what's best for us. It's actually the best for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to this loneliness piece, which we
Yeah.
mentioned. A stat is about 51% of Australians feel lonely at least once a week. Loneliness, which Johan Hari, the author of Lost Connections, is why Lisa and I started one another in the first place.
Awesome.
He essentially argues that loneliness comes from this concept of a lack of shared experiences. What are some tips and tricks for people who may be listening or who are feeling this sense of loneliness?
Yeah.
We've talked about the benefits of communication with your baristas and just everyday folks. We talked about potentially helping your neighbours and everyday folks. What are some other small baby steps that if someone was listening is feeling lonely could do?
I think and I'm more conscious of this now when I talk about this kind of stuff, is that like I'm quite extroverted and social, and so I've got to acknowledge that not everyone is like me and wants to go out and socialise heaps and maybe be as vocal and expressive as myself. But I think that like everyone has to find their tribe. There's 7 billion people on Earth, and we're all mostly connected to the internet. Like you will find people like you, and so for people that feel like they are maybe more isolated or don't have the social circles or the communities to be a part of, like find communities around the stuff that you're interested in. Like I think having hobbies is super important, and an important part of hobbies is connecting with people like you over stuff you're all interested in. And I'm also a believer that can't just be through online forums, because like if you take online gaming as an example, it's a great way for people that don't love to socialise to connect, but you also see higher rates of poor mental health in gaming and online communities. So like to me that says you still need the in-person aspect. And there are in-person aspects to those communities. But I think it's finding, like my suggestion is like find people that are interested in the shit you're interested in with, and then reach out to them.
So maybe use
connect with
online
them.
for that
Yeah,
to find.
it's a great way to find people, right?
Yeah.
Or like start the thing. Like if you start the run club or the group that goes down to the beach and has coffee in the morning with locals or whatever. There's more of those kind of things popping up, but they only pop up because someone decides that they want to do it.
Yeah.
I think being proactive with it is important, because like no one's going to come along and do it for you. And part of the challenge is that when people are in a bad headspace, they tend to regress or isolate themselves more. So usually people who are already isolated are at a higher risk of being in a poorer headspace or having poorer mental health. So it's important for other people to be aware of, right? If people are isolating themselves, like how can you help those people and try and get them out as well? Because it's a huge challenge with people who are suffering with like particularly anxiety or depression. Like there's a state of fear or anxiety. If someone's in that state, they're not really thinking about other people. They're thinking about themselves because they're trying to protect themselves or be safe or feel safe. And so sometimes people in those headspaces can be isolated. They can be frustrating to deal with, because if you're in a clearer headspace, you just don't understand, like, well, why won't you just do this thing, or why won't you come and do this? So there's like also a patience game when you're dealing with people like that, because it's a sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Of like, no one likes me, no one wants to hang out with me, I'm not going to bother going to the pub with everyone because they don't want me to be there. And then you're going to sit at home and feel worse and worse about that. And then if you do go out and you're being negative, people are like, oh, they're such a drain to be around. But sometimes I find like, if people are being a drain, it's like they're usually people that need a hand or need help. But we just don't have the patience a lot of time to deal with those people. So, I think like it's a really hard one, right? But it goes both ways. It's like be aware of the people in your circle, but also think about yourself and self-reflect and how, like, what are the things that you can be a part of or you can contribute to. Finding some sort of like challenge or like setting some sort of goal is a really good way to connect with people as well. Like that's why people do marathons and then join run clubs, because it's like it's a lot easier to achieve something like that if you're surrounded by other people. It's why gym classes are effective. So just try and find something to do that you can kind of engage people through as well. But it's going to feel good because then you're doing something, you're working towards something, and you're getting positive feedback from people as well that you're doing a good job or that you're, having a crack. And that's part of the sort of psychology of it as well, I think.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point, that every individual is unique. We are simply sitting here talking about our individual experiences. But human connection has been a need since the dawn of time. Tribalism, community, we as humans wouldn't be here having this conversation if it wasn't for tribalism and community. You mentioned the 3 C's at the start, which was connection, communication, and community.
Yeah.
We've spoken through a few different ways to essentially achieve that communication. It's important to be open, to share your vulnerabilities as well. I think one of the biggest learning curves there is from those 3 a.m. 3 a.m. discussions. Challenge yourself to send a acknowledged text message up the next day. It will have monumental impact. Then we digressed and talked about the importance of shared experiences. You can either go and join someone else's shared experience, or you can create your own experience and encourage other people to come and enjoy your experience. We could talk about this for a very long time, but just wrapping things up, back to you. What is, I guess, a final tip or point you want to share around this power of human connection?
I think the biggest thing for me, and the reason it matters and what I pin it back to is, it's just what makes people happy. If you think about the happiest points in your life, for most people, they think of shared experiences. There's a few quick examples. The book or the movie Into the Wild, a guy called Christopher McCandless went out into the wilderness to seek happiness. Spoiler alert, he died alone. One of the things he wrote in his journal was true happiness only exists when shared, because if you achieve something great or you do something fun and you look around and there's no one there to share it with, I think there's an emptiness that comes with that, and that stems through so many different parts of life. There's the Harvard happiness study, which is what it's referred to, which is a 100-year study into what makes people happy. And the only sort of leading indicator or only indicator of future happiness that they could find was the number of positive relationships in your life. So the more positive relationships you have at 40, the more likely you are to be happy at 50 and so on. And I think it's just, for me, it's realizing that we're all chasing in some form happiness. I think somewhere along the way, way too many of us got caught up thinking that happiness comes from money and success and fame and acknowledgement. And it actually doesn't. It comes from sitting down and looking around and having a bunch of people around you that you love and care about, or that you have fun with, and knowing that they feel the same way about you. That's to me what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely love that. The entire point of these Do Good, Feel Good podcasts is to add value to you, the listeners. So the final 2 tips, which I've taken from Ben, which I'll leave with you, is 1, go and find out your barista's name and actually ask them deep and meaningful questions and get to interact with them. And 2, post a late night conversation with one of your friends. Please send them a text message follow up acknowledging them the next day. If more of the world do these 2 things, that is positive, more powerful human interactions, which scientifically and through our conversation is proven to bring you more happiness. So Ben, thank you for joining. We'll wrap it up there. Hope everyone has enjoyed listening, and cheers to you, Ben. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Pleasure. Cheers, everyone.